The ANASAZI tribe, an advanced civilization for its time, appeared to vanish without a trace around the 13th century. But before we get into the truth of why they vanished, be sure to go ahead and slap that subscribe button down below because I release storytelling of the mysterious and supernatural. Let's go. The ANASAZI tribe is one of the most renowned ancient tribes that mysteriously vanished. Their areas of occupancy actually exist as modern-day states of Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and even parts of New Mexico. It's believed that sometime in the late 13th century, the tribe, for whatever reason, just abandoned their settlements. If you look at the vivid detail, it was almost like a mini Mecca. We're talking about buildings made up of 5 stories and even 800 rooms. In fact, many modern-day Native American tribes can supposedly trace their ancestry back to this one tribe. Even their legends state that the disappearance was due to this tribe going home. But what exactly does that mean? Many people in turn associate this with the ancient astronaut theory, due to all the legends and myths associated with them. Apparently, there are also several strange markings of weird circular lines spiraling on the older ruins of these settlements. Many researchers claim that the markings actually represent the sun, but those who believe in the lore and legends of the ancient tribe know these markings to be actual representations of portals, or dare I say, stargates. Like many ancient tribes, this one seemed to be extremely intelligent in its design and understanding of what we would comprehend as modern advanced concepts. In fact, Colorado's own Mesa Verde National Park is home to the Sun Temple. Built roughly around 1200 AD, it was sometimes used for ceremonies and solstice tracking. But what's more intriguing is the perfect architecture of this beautiful ancient palace. We're talking about near-perfect squares and different forms of triangles, all repeating at key points across the location. Equilateral triangles, 45-degree right triangles, even Pythagorean triangles. And a favorite of ancient Greek and Egyptian architects is the renowned golden rectangle. It appears that the most common unit of measurement at the temple was around 30 centimeters. So, with all this information, what exactly about it makes this so interesting? Well, for one, is that these civilizations in this area at the time had no existing number system or even a written language, or so it is theorized. And somehow, they managed to exercise incredibly advanced geometry techniques to build a sophisticated architecture for the time being. To put in an equivalence of today's standards, that's like trying to design and build a house without use of any records or numbers, simply just winging it. Okay, so we get their geometry is on point, but let's look at some more interesting things about this tribe that could possibly lead to the hypothesis that something interfered with their disappearance and not on their own accord. With a civilization so advanced, had they just uprooted and traveled elsewhere en masse? Don't you think there would be at least historical documents or records of that somewhere? I mean, surely other tribes in the area would know about this. In 1897, they had found up to 30 macaw skeletons in the Chaco Canyon, specifically in the Pueblo Bonito. The Pueblo Bonito is a multi-storied home carved within the rocks of the mountains. Keep in mind that at the time, scarlet macaws, which were imported from Mesoamerica, had a high value attached to them. They were often used in religious ceremonies and sacrifices. Their feathers were also commonly used in other artifacts and clothing. What this means is that the civilization actually had the ability to trade with far-off places, which would further suggest they had very large and powerful economic growth. More evidence that they just disappeared without a trace, without any written record, just doesn't make sense. It is speculated that their far-off trading began as far back as the year 1800 AD, which means that their trade routes influenced a much more complex culture. When it came to ownership and trade, they knew what they were doing. Further inside the Pueblo Bonito, on more skeletons, there is a chamber or room known as Room 33, which actually held 14 different bodies over a span of 300 years, give or take. not to mention a wealth of ancient artifacts that has given researchers some insight into how this elite society ruled and worked. Now, check this out. In an attempt to find family ties using mitochondrial DNA, researchers and scientists believe what they had found had actually been contaminated DNA samples. However, after renewing and testing again, the results were unchanging. What they had found from the mitochondrial DNA is that this tribe had descended from a single female ancestor. Many claims that this is just further proof that this advanced society was placed here by other beings and later reclaimed, hence the tribe using the term go home. However, if we are to look at this from a reasonable and logical perspective, the reason they abandoned their settlement could be from droughts. Scientists have gathered information from well over 1,000 settlement sites in relation to the Pueblos. Using this in conjunction with around 30,000 tree ring dates, scientists are kind of able to stitch together almost a year-by-year review of the region's weather patterns. Over the course of this advanced in-depth study, there was a clear sign of a recurrent cycle of drought. During the span of roughly 500 years, 700 to around 1250 AD, there were about 4 dry periods. The worst, of course, was the latest. When these dry periods would strike, the destruction was so great that civil unrest, destruction of crops, and starvation, and all the things that come with that. It appears through scientific data that the weather collected proves that social changes were brought on with every drought. This indicates, or is hypothesized to indicate, that this tribe that mysteriously vanished was actually a cultural transition and not them being taken home by their intergalactic neighbors. Did the ANASAZI tribe truly abandon their settlements for greener pastures elsewhere? Maybe they slowly integrated into other societies over time and that part of history just became lost. Or were they truly taken by much more powerful advanced sentient beings? You be the judge on which one is the truth. This still stands as one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries. Back in 1587, a group of roughly 115 settlers arrived on Roanoke Island. Many of us are probably familiar with the Roanoke Island, located in North Carolina. The colony that established that island was actually supposedly one of the very first from England. The settlement started off as very promising. However, as John White, who at the time was governor of the colony, returned from a supply trip from Europe, it was here he discovered that the entire settlement had been completely abandoned with no trace of anybody. However, there was a single skeleton with the words Croatoan etched into a nearby tree. This can mean only a few different things. Either the settlement fell victim to the Croatoan tribe and was possibly enslaved or killed during John White's voyage, or everybody in the settlement fled to different locations due to some sort of unknown conflict with that tribe. This wouldn't be that difficult considering the Croatoan tribe are only slightly south of the Roanoke colony. After all, it took John White 3 years upon returning to the colony due to a war in Europe at the time. It's possible that everybody in the settlement did eventually flee back to Europe, convinced the governor had completely abandoned them. But then we have to ask, did they perish in the icy cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean, or did they actually make their way back to Europe and integrate as intended? Either way, we'll never know the truth. But to dig deeper into this mystery, we need to first understand why John White, the governor at the time, needed to go back to Europe. It is believed that he needed to gather a fresh load of supplies. While his intentions were good, he could not help but be delayed, because as soon as he arrived back in England, it just so happens that a major naval war broke out between Spain and England. It was here that Queen Elizabeth I had called on every available ship to come against the Spanish Armada. As previously stated, it was a full 3 years in 1590 when John White was finally able to return to the island of Roanoke. The idea that he just happened to abandon his people is pretty unlikely when people suggest that theory. I mean, you have to remember, he had also left behind his wife, his infant daughter, and older daughter, and other people and children in the town that relied upon him. So you can imagine his heartbreak upon returning to not find a trace of them anywhere. Now, fast forwarding to modern day, and investigations are still ongoing. What was the fate of the lost colony of Roanoke? Well, it wasn't until 2007 where efforts really began to work on collecting and analyzing DNA from families in the local area, just to try and find out what happened. Obviously, DNA would become mixed and absorbed within the people in the area over time. There was a mission to set out who had ancestral DNA to the Roanoke settlers or local Native American tribes. However, even these have proved inconclusive and do not provide many answers. Fortunately, the next group of English settlers was much more successful in establishing a flourishing settlement 7 years after this, north at Jamestown. The ancient civilization of the Indus Valley is one that has incredibly intriguing ties. However, the reason behind their sudden disappearance will definitely startle you. The Indus Valley, located near modern-day Pakistan, was a civilization all in its own. In fact, it is said that the civilization that resided in the Indus Valley was so powerful that it actually rivaled the strength of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. They had systems in place that allowed them clean drinking water, brick baths, and an intricately designed drainage and sewer system. Not to mention advanced urban infrastructure and other amazing cultural achievements of the ancient world. They often possessed sophisticated skill sets like measurement, arithmetic, and decimal skills. It is unclear, though, whether this civilization possessed a written symbolic language or actually had a full-blown written language. These people also mass-produced pottery filled with fine geometric artwork and decoration. Their agricultural community, which was rich with rice, mustard and sesame seeds, wheat, cotton, and a plethora of other grains. They also had a lot of animals like dogs, cats, pigs, goats, elephants, chickens, and more. With a civilization so advanced and diverse for the time, our first guess would be that they were conquered at some point, like the Greeks and the Romans. However, evidence proves otherwise. It seems that sometime between 1800 and 1700 BC, the civilization just mysteriously vanished altogether. There is no trace of evidence of what had befallen these people. However, of course, there are theories, and I will tell you the most shocking and riveting one. There's the belief that these people were eradicated from a nuclear strike. Yes, you've heard me correctly. As the investigation has begun on this ancient site, there have been more than 40 skeletons found, all scattered throughout. Additional testing and the way in which these bodies were found positioned suggested they had died suddenly. In fact, a man by the name of David Davenport, a researcher from England who had researched these sites and studied the writings for well over a decade, he believed he had found evidence of radiation and the apparent presence of using materials. All of these things will suggest a sudden, violent, and intense exposure to extremely high levels of heat. It's his theory that it has been accepted that there was some intentional nuclear strike and, in turn, an explosion that cleared out the entire city as well as the civilization. Yet, another theory remains that there was actually a shift in the Indus River nearby, and it's possible that the people had dammed the water along a portion of the river and in turn suffered temporary flooding. This theory is also likely because it would explain the thick layers of silt that sit roughly 30 feet above the level of the river at the site of this ancient civilization. Another popular theory is weather pattern changes, a decline in rainfall. This would cause the agricultural system of the economy to fail and for everyone to abandon their cities en masse in search of food and water. It is suspected that around 1500 BC, the Indus Valley region experienced much higher rainfall than usual, making it suddenly suitable for supporting life. Of course, scholars will argue that between 1500 and 1200 people had actually migrated from the northwest, possibly from what is now known as Russia, going through Afghanistan. These migrants were to be known at the time as Aryans, and would later be classified as Indo-Europeans. So, if other tribes and groups of people were successful in moving into the area and re-inhabiting several parts of the land, does that completely negate the theory that a nuclear strike had happened? The reason why I say this is because you have to think of contamination with radiation. Apparently, during an investigation, several scholars and researchers alike had found traces of radiation found at the site. And if this is the case, that would make it uninhabitable for any future groups of people to settle here in this area. However, the range in which the radiation still exists is unknown. So while it is possible for civilizations to have come down this direction, it's probably not that they settled around the city, but probably far off where there would not be radiation. Even though there are several theories, there doesn't seem to be one concrete answer that scholars, scientists, and researchers can all agree on due to conflicting evidence. One thing is for certain: whether they were wiped out by a sudden explosion of some kind or left to starve, what was it that drove this ancient civilization out of its flourishing homeland? In November of 1930, a fur trapper by the name of Joe LaBelle had come across a small Inuit settlement right around Anjukuni Lake. Seeking rest for the night and tired from the day's voyage, he was shocked by what he found, or should I say, what he did not find. The entire village was completely empty. There was not a soul around. He would check inside the buildings, and there was a fire burning beneath a pot with food inside. Personal possessions lay strewn about. Even the supplies and a fish supply were untouched and in abundance. It appeared as if the entire village just up and left at a moment's notice. Their weapons, food supplies, and additional clothing were all left as well. Completely perplexed by his findings, he immediately informed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, also known as the RCMP, from the nearest telegraph office. The story then goes that they had set up men to investigate, and on the way, they had stopped for some food at the home of a local trapper by the name of Armand Laurent. What he had told them adds a very interesting twist to everything. Now, there's no definitive proof that what he told them has any part to play in this Inuit settlement being abandoned, but it sure makes things a heck of a lot more interesting. He informed them that several nights before, he had seen a strange metallic gleaming object flying right over his property. And what's even more strange is it was headed in the direction of where the abandoned Inuit settlement now lay. Once the RCMP was able to arrive at this Inuit village, they too confirmed that it was completely abandoned. After closer investigation, it was estimated at the time that the Inuit village had been abandoned for roughly 8 weeks prior to LaBelle's arrival. Also, something weird. The graves that sat on the edge of the settlement were busted open, and the bodies inside were missing. The stone markers that marked the graves were also placed in piles on each side of the graves. Something definitely was going on, but the mystery remains. What? While all of it sounds good and spooky, the further investigation does reveal some inconsistencies in the original account by Joe LaBelle. For example, the missing Inuit kayaks would not have been battered by waves during this time of abandonment, simply because the lake was frozen. Apparently, it was originally noted that the Inuit village consisted of around 30 persons, and later retellings of the story, the village size increased, and other facts would become embellished on. The other portion is that there is essentially no physical village that exists around this lake. It doesn't mean that there isn't a village there. It just means that there is no written or verbal account of anybody going up there to verify a village exists, and any clearing of what it used to be is there. Now, if we go a little bit further, things seem to point at this story as an actual fabrication by a man named Frank Edwards for his book Stranger Than Science, which was released in 1959. While Joe LaBelle was a real person, there is actually no verbal or written verification of him ever coming to said village. The original story was believed to be traced back to The Bee, a newspaper out of Danville, Virginia. Also, on the side of the RCMP, they've apparently had their hands full with requests of this case, but there's been no evidence of an investigation in their filings as claimed in the story. This does make things rather interesting. Is this a case of a clever cover-up in hopes to deceive those of the truth that supposedly alien beings had abducted the entire Inuit village, or is this simply a fabricated story designed to thrill and entice its viewers? You can spend hours deep diving into the background of this story. I'll let you be the judge of what you want the story to be. The DAHLSJO case. Our last story for today covers the most bizarre and only mass disappearance to happen in the country of Sweden. In fact, the Swedes have seen nothing like this in their entire history. The story would take place on July 29, 1965 in Gothenburg, Sweden. For this case, instead of an entire civilization going missing, 4 men mysteriously vanished into thin air. The most interesting part of this case is the fact that even now, we have no idea what became of these 4 men. 3 men, who were friends, all worked together at a shipyard, decided to hitch a ride together, driving a blue Volvo out of town. This happened on a rainy July morning in which it is believed they hitchhiked together to an unknown destination. However, it was not immediately reported on that these 3 men went missing, so the corroboration between times and families does differentiate. It was also noted that none of them had driver's licenses, which meant that they were driving illegally. Looking a little further into all three of their past, some of them had dealt with petty crimes, but despite that, they all seemed like relatively good guys. As far as these three men, we have no idea really what became of them. Now, we include the fourth person, who was apparently also traveling through Gothenburg on the same day, right around the same time. He had apparently even sent his family a postcard that read something along the lines of, "All is well, don't worry." Now, according to his family, this was his last known location. Authorities speculate that it's possible he hitched a ride with the three men in the blue Volvo, or that he too mysteriously disappeared in much the same way they did. Even now, all these years later, the case remains completely unsolved, and there are arguments amongst authorities about who is involved and why. People go missing all the time, so it's possible that the three men in the blue Volvo were attacked. It seems unlikely that even a search and rescue from the Swedish government, that they were unable to turn up any trace of them. Even though this case is overseas, the fact that these four individuals seem to disappear and vanish sets for a grim outcome. What's interesting is that the port of Gothenburg has been Sweden's largest gateway for the rest of the world for trade and travel. This channel has opened up even more for Sweden right after the events of World War II, when Europe had begun rebuilding. And Sweden, at the time, had a huge demand for wood, steel, and other miscellaneous products. Some theories have suggested that these three men had changed their identities and stayed working at the harbor. But why would they go so far as to try and conceal their identities? A very strange observation was actually made by the sister of one of the missing men. A short time after his disappearance, she went to go search for her brother at the apartment where he had lived. However, when she had knocked on the door, a stranger had answered, having no idea of anybody who had lived there before him, nor of her brother. However, the man who had answered the door was actually wearing a piece of clothing that she had actually made specifically for her brother. Personally, I have no idea how much time, energy, and focus the Swedish government has dedicated to this case, but there have been a plethora of amateur detectives trying to connect the dots between all the missing persons in an attempt to finally unveil any information. Nothing has been pulled up yet. Are these all genuine cases of real missing civilizations, enriched in mystery and conspiracy? Or are there logical explanations for every single one of these disappearances, and they've been blown out of proportion? I'll let you guys be the judge. I would love to know what you think in the comments below. So be sure to go ahead and smack that like button and leave a comment down below. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and hit that big old red subscribe button for more content just like this of storytelling on the mysterious and supernatural. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll check you guys in the very next video.